Hey guys, so I'm going to teach you how to make this chunky chenille. I don't know how to say it. Chunky chenille yarn blanket. This blanket is probably about like 6 feet and it took bigger than 6 feet. I'm really bad at measuring. It's like big enough to wrap around your body and like cuddle with it. And I'm 5'8", so long enough. Anyway, so it took 6 skeins of chunky chenille yarn from Walmart. And it ended up being like $35 for the yarn, and it took me a few days. But as some of you know, I am a quadriplegic, so that played into it a little bit of how long it took. It also played into how hard it was filming this video and seeing what I was doing. So if you can't see, go look at another YouTube video. Like, I'm not offended. I'm not a professional. I'm making this because some people had asked how I did it. I have OT friends and other fellow quad friends who sometimes it's good just to see how another person does it and, see if there's any strategies or techniques that you can borrow from them. So that's why I'm doing this. Also, we're quarantined, and I think that this is just like something creative that we can all do, something to keep us away from social media and just to keep our minds, busy and producing things. And I think it's so helpful for our mental health just to see things being like produced. Oftentimes we're so close to the work that we're doing that we don't get to see progress being made. And with this, you're like wrapped in it. It is awesome. So all right, we're gonna hop into it now. I hope you guys can see what I'm doing. If not, like I said, there's a ton of other YouTube videos out there. So you're gonna start by tying a knot at the end of your yarn. This side of the yarn will be called the tail. Everything attached to the skein of yarn is called the working yarn. So you're gonna start by making a slip knot. You take the tail and cross it in front of the working yarn, and then pull the working yarn through the loop that you just made. Then you hold the working yarn and pull the loop tight. You want to make sure that this loop is really tight because this is your first stitch. So you want to make sure that the slip knot is really tight because it's going to be your first stitch. It's also important to make sure that the stitches are all the same length. So this is about probably an inch or so, and that's how big you'll want all of your stitches to be. So you'll take the tail and put it off to the left, lay the first stitch down flat on the table, have the working yarn behind the stitch and pull the working yarn up through the first stitch. And then turn the stitch so that the working yarn ends facing towards you again. See how it's on my lap? And then I pull it so that this stitch is the same length as the first stitch. Like I said, you want it to be about an inch. Always leave the working yarn behind the stitches. That makes it much easier to avoid any mistakes. So again, pull it up through and twist the stitch down so that the working yarn is facing you. Again, pull it through and turn it so that the working yarn is facing you. And you'll see that it's starting to create a braid. For this 4x6 blanket, I did about 30 loops or stitches in the original chain. However many stitches, however long you make your original chain, that's how wide your blanket will be. You can always make the blanket longer, but once you make the blanket a certain width, you cannot change that. I like to make sure that I have some working yarn pulled off of the skein just to make my life a little bit easier. Anything that can do that, I am here for that. You can see that I accidentally made that stitch just a little bit too big, so I'm pulling on the working yarn just so it's the same size as the other stitches. The reason that I keep the stitches all the same size is that if there's one that's bigger or if you accidentally forget to turn the working yarn towards you, there will be a gap in your blanket and it can create some sagging And this is yarn, so the blanket will stretch out over time. So if it starts with gaps, then they'll just get bigger. It's not a huge deal, but whenever you're cuddling with the blanket and a finger goes through or a toe goes through, it's just kind of annoying. So I'm making this the last stitch in my row, and I'll show you now how to create the next row. It's the exact same thing. You pull the working yarn through the previous loop, and instead of laying it flat that way, you pull it up to create the next row. So now I'm just going to take the skein and the working yarn and move it to the opposite side. This isn't totally necessary, but this next part can be tricky, and this helps keep it a little bit more organized. So to continue making the second row, you're going to pull the working yarn through each bump. It's a little bit hard to see, but you had already pulled the working yarn through the previous one, and then that one that I'm touching with my right hand is the next bump. You always want to pull through the top part of the bump. So you stick your fingers in through the top part of the loop. I'm going to stick 2 fingers in because my fingers don't work. And then you take the working yarn from behind and pull it through for a loop. Again, make sure the loop is the same length as the other loop. So then you just move to the next bump. It can be a little bit tricky to see where the bumps are, but just do your best. So then you just move on to the next bump and you pull the working yarn through the back. If you pull the working yarn through the top, it'll create a different stitch, which I'll show you whenever we get to the big blanket. I'll show you how to do the different stitches, but for right now, we want to make sure all the stitches are the exact same. So we're pulling through the back, and make sure that you're pulling through the top part of the loop and not the bottom. That's why I found that it's best that if you sit at a table instead of doing it on your lap or whatever, if you sit at a table or on the ground and leave the chain flat so that it doesn't get twisted or anything. I know at this point it may look like a hot mess, but if you've made it this far, you are doing great. Keep going. Like many things in life, whenever you first start it, it doesn't look good, but if you keep going, it will get better. And I would give it till the second or third row, and if it doesn't get better, maybe you did do it wrong. Like I said before, there's other YouTube videos out there. Whenever I first got started, I had to start over so many times. There were so many tears, so many swear words, but now I can make these blankets and it's just super relaxing. It's not frustrating anymore, and I hope that it does the same for you guys. So as you start pulling the loops up through the original chain, you want to make sure that the loops, again, are the same length as the previous one. And I keep pulling on the chain to tighten it. That helps me find the next bump. And I also pull on the previous loop before, just to kind of even out the next loops. You can see here that the original chain got a little bit twisted. That might have happened because maybe I made the stitch in the original chain just a little bit too tight or a different length. That can happen sometimes. Just do the best that you can trying to find the top bump. If you can't find it, you can skip it. It's not the end of the world. There will just be a little bit of a gap in your blanket, but you can fix that by making the other loops close to each other and pulling tight as you work through the blanket. This chain isn't 30 links. I forgot to mention this in the intro, but I was making a blanket and then I was like, oh shoot, wait, I should record myself doing this and teach people who have been asking how to do it. And instead of starting a whole blanket over again, I just decided to use this chain as a demonstration. So later in the video, you'll see me switch over to the big blanket. Don't be confused, that's what happened. But it's the exact same process.
You can see that this part is difficult for me, obviously because my hands are paralyzed, but even if your hands aren't paralyzed, this part is the hardest because you have to make the links in the original chain so tight to hold the blanket together that it can be difficult to pull the thickness of the yarn through the tight loops. But once you get past this part, it just gets so much easier. For those of you watching that are occupational therapists, or maybe you have a spinal cord injury yourself, I don't have any finger function. I have a little bit of tension in my right middle finger that I sometimes use to pull the yarn through, but everything else is just tenodesis. I keep going back and pulling on the loops that I just did and messing with the original chain. That's intentional, just to make sure that the previous loops are tight and to keep everything straight. This just ensures that I'm not going to miss any loops later, or that there's not going to be one loop that's way bigger. It's easier to fix this problem now versus later in the blanket whenever there's a massive gap and going back to try to figure out how to fix that. So we're coming down to the last two bumps on the original chain, and this can be a little bit difficult as well, again because the links are so tight. You might think that the last bump you see is the last link, but it's not. Don't forget about the slip knot bump. And that, honestly, that one is the hardest to pull through. I don't care if your hands are paralyzed or not. That link is hard to pull through because it can get twisted. It just gets a little bit tangled up. Pull it through. So close. Okay, we did it. Perfect. So now before I start my next row, I'm just going to go back and try to even up all of the loops. You can see, you hold it up, check it out, make sure that they're all the same. If they're not, if you pull the loop next to it, it will pull and even out the other one. You can see that some of my loops are different lengths, but that is okay. Like I said, I'll pull them up whenever I go back through to do the next loop. So to start the next row, you keep the working yarn, and I'm going to fix my last loop because it was a little bit too big for me, so I'm just going to do that by pulling on the working yarn. I like to keep my end loops on the smaller side so that the blanket doesn't get saggy. So again, I'm going to take the working yarn in the skein and move it to the opposite side. And I'm going to pull off some extra working yarn while I'm at it. I like to leave the working yarn kind of above, so it makes it easier to pull through the loop. So I have the working yarn on the outside of the end loop. I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to pull it from behind and then pull a second loop through. This will start the next row. After you get that loop pulled through, just give it a little tug so that the end of the blanket is kind of reinforced and that loop isn't going anywhere. Then you're going to move on to the next loop, and you do the same thing. Pull the working yarn from behind and pull it up through that row. Then pull it from behind and up through. I've gone through some trial and error and have definitely found that it's easier to leave the working yarn above / kind of behind the current loops that you have. It just makes it go a little bit faster. And you can see again with every stitch that I make, I just go back and pull on the other loops and hold on the bottom chain again, just to keep everything nice and tight. And that's it, guys. You just keep repeating that process until you reach the end of the skein. You pull the working yarn through the back, and at the end of the blanket, you just create 2 loops. Keep doing that until you reach the end of the skein, and that's what you'll see in a few seconds is how to connect them together. To join 2 skeins together, all you do is tie each end together just in a plain old knot and leave enough yarn on either end. When I first started, I made the mistake of cutting the excess off, thinking that it would look better, but there ended up being little nubs sticking out of the blanket. Don't worry about the excess yarn. We will get to that at the very end. Even though parts of this video have changed as my videoing skills have evolved, different angle, different lighting, different outfit, different blanket, you can see that some things haven't changed. I'm still messing with the blanket. I'm still pulling on each loop. Again, this is just to ensure tightness. You can see that not every stitch is the same length, and that's okay, but just relatively close to the same length is good. When you get to the part where the 2 skeins are tied together and there's a knot, it can be a little bit tricky, but don't get discouraged. Just keep pulling the working yarn through the back how you were doing before. Sometimes the knot will be in between 2 stitches, sometimes it will be in the middle of a loop, in the middle of a new loop. Either way is okay, just make sure that you're keeping the stitches the same length and the same tightness. There's obviously going to be a bump where the knot is, and that's where I like to switch stitches and change the direction of the way that the stitches are going so that that knot blends in a little bit better. It also just gives the blanket a little bit more texture to change directions with each skein. You definitely don't have to do that. I haven't done that with every blanket. You can still weave the fabric in so that the knot isn't noticeable, but what I like to do is switch stitches, switch stitch direction. My gosh, that was hard. Switch stitch direction with every skein. You don't want to switch stitch direction in the middle of the blanket. I always wait until I get to the end of the row, and we're coming up on the end of the row in a few stitches here. I'm still working on the knotted part. Again, it's a little bit tricky. It can just be bulky and hard, but keep working at it. But I'll show you in a few seconds how to switch directions. Okay, so whenever you've made it to the last stitch of the row that has the knot in it, pull the working yarn through to create the last stitch, but don't pull a second knot through to create the next row. There's a few ways to do this next part. What I do is take the blanket and flip it over. I found that this works best for me and how I can pull the yarn through. I do this so that I can continue to pull the yarn through the back. I found that I have a difficult time pulling the yarn through the top part of the loop. But if you're able to pull the yarn through the top part of the loop, knock yourself out. That might save you some hassle flipping the blanket. So now you're just going to do the same thing, and it can be a little bit tricky. You take the working yarn from the outside of the loop and pull it up through, just how you did with all of the other stitches. I'm honestly not 100% sure why it is a little bit tougher to switch stitches on the first loop. It almost feels a little bit like the original chain, where it can be harder to pull through the original loop. And you can see that my loop from the row before are just little nubs, barely there, and definitely not an inch. I tend to make the loops smaller just unintentionally as I go. So that's why it's nice to be able to pull the loop and make it a little bit bigger if you have to. But whenever you're switching stitch directions, it can be difficult to pull that. Again, just do your best, have patience, you'll get there. Again, so you just continue to take the working yarn and pull it through the back if that's the direction that you're going, or pull it through the top if that's what you decided to do. You keep doing that throughout the whole blanket, and to finish it, which I'll show you here in a few seconds, you want to make sure that you have enough yarn left that is about 3 times the width of your blanket. To cast off and finish the blanket, you take the last 2 stitches of the row. I messed up at this point. I should have taken the working yarn through the back, but I took it through the front, and that's okay, I made it work. You take the working yarn and feed it through 2 loops at one time. I had a really hard time trying to get the yarn through 2 loops at one time. So what I ended up doing was taking the working yarn and making a new loop through the second to last stitch, and then taking that loop and pulling it through the very last loop to create the first finishing stitch, which I'm going to pull out here in a second. Make sure that you're pulling that final loop out to be a good length. And again, it can be a little bit tricky because the yarn does get bulky. Then just continue the process. So either hold the 2 loops together or do it how I do, or how I figure out how to do in about a second. Apparently I didn't figure it out yet, but I'm pulling the working yarn through the second to last loop and then pulling that loop through the big mama loop. Here's where you can tell that I realized I made a mistake in pulling the working yarn the wrong way, but really it is not a big deal. It's a little bit extra bulky over there, but it's not the end of the world. I probably could have gone back and fixed it if I wanted to, but at this point, I was pretty over it. You can kind of start to see that it's creating a braid, very similar to the chain at the bottom. And I keep turning the top part. There's no specific way to turn the chains whenever you're ending them. You're gonna have to look at the blanket however you do it and just make sure that the top part is laying flat. So you just continue that process of either holding the two loops together or feeding the working yarn through the previous loop and then into the big loop. Believe it or not, I did speed the video up for you guys. It just kind of takes a while. Whether your hands are paralyzed or not, making this blanket really is a labor of love, and it can be really relaxing for yourself as well. I'm gonna leave the rest of the footage of how to finish the blanket in there just in case you still need a guide. But if you are totally a pro by now and know what to do, go ahead and jump to the 33-minute mark to finish off the blanket. Even though you're finishing off the blanket, it's still important to pull on the previous loop, the loop from the row below, and the big loop that you're working on, just to again ensure that everything's tight. Like I said, the blanket will stretch out over time, so the tighter that it is whenever you first start, the better. On the very last 2 stitches, you do it exactly how you've been doing it the whole time. You pull the working yarn either through the very last stitch and then the last big stitch together, or you do them together. Once you pull that through and have the very last loop, you'll cut the rest of your yarn off just to make it a little bit easier. You want to leave about a foot. I think that's about a foot, right? I'm not good at eyeballing things, but you want to leave about a foot, and then you'll take the end of that yarn and pull it through the very last loop to create a knot. And again, as I've been saying throughout this whole video, make sure that knot is tight. I've made the mistake before of pulling it a little bit too soon and having a knot up way too high. I'm gonna go in and just make a second knot just to make sure that the blanket's really tight and secure. I would not be happy if I spent days making this blanket and it all unraveled just because I didn't make a second knot. Now I'm just taking the tail end of the yarn and weaving it back through the closing of the blanket. Sometimes there will be little holes down the side of the blanket, which I now see when I'm making this video, that maybe I could have used the tail end and woven it down that way to make it look a little bit fuller. But really the idea is just to tuck the yarn in there so that there's nothing flying around. This is exactly what you're going to do with the tail ends of the yarn that you tied together whenever you combine 2 skeins together. For those of you that aren't quads and are like, what is she doing? I wrap the yarn around my finger since I can't grab it, just to pull it tighter. You can tell I got annoyed and I was just really done with the whole process, so I felt I had weaved it in enough, so I just cut the very end off and moved on to feed the other ones in. So I'll show you how everything looks once it's all weaved in and the final stitches and the final blanket. So good luck guys, I hope you have fun.